keep thinking back to those frustrating design patterns that we talked about at the beginning of the day yesterday. So we kicked it off talking about all of those things that are just really obnoxious in user experience design. The things that we're constantly trying to combat, that we face, and we don't want to have to work against ourselves. So that was really interesting to me, even just to mentally vent on the fact that other people have those same concerns as well. And perfect, we have RENÉE, so I won't regale you with more of my ramblings over here. We'll hear from someone who's got a lot more exciting stuff to tell us about building a design culture for inclusivity.
Thank you so much again for having me. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Not sure where everyone is, but I know this is a global conference. So I'm going to actually try something. I apologize if I'm butchering this, but I've been asking a couple of people how to say hello. So I've been saying sziasztok. So hopefully I am saying that correctly. Give me an E for effort and trying to say hello in Hungarian. So sziasztok to everyone. I am really just thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you about building a design culture for inclusivity, or an inclusive design culture. And this conference has been packed with so much information, so much rich information about what inclusive design is, what does it look like. But I also want to add another layer, another lens onto this as well, to really talk about the importance of setting up a culture, practices that are ready for inclusive design and inclusivity. Inclusivity and being inclusive and having inclusive design doesn't just show up in the office in a design overnight. And I want to make sure that teams, our UX culture, UX practice is really being honest with ourselves. Inclusivity has been around for decades. We know that inclusive design has been around for decades. But has it really had this level of amplification all that time? No. Has it been something that has been embedded into curriculums and the canons of design? Not necessarily. So we need to make sure that we're being really truthful and honest with ourselves. And we've got to undo some things, redo some things to really get to the levels that we're trying to get to in inclusivity and design. I'm just glad we're having this conversation, and it's already in practice and people are doing it well. So it's not a lost cause, but there's definitely some things that we can set up for success. So I want to make sure that you connect with me. So as you're listening to this presentation, if I say something, I call it my gems. If there's a gem that really resonates with you, first connect with me. But if you decide to share it outside in the social media internets of the world, we say it plural, internets, connect with me, tag me, please. If you have, you can scan this QR code. This will bring you to my LinkedIn profile. Just hold your camera up and it will bring you to my LinkedIn profile. You can connect or follow. If you want to connect and you don't see a connect button, hit the 3 dots. That's the ellipse of the ellipsis. I'm talking to hopefully a room of designers that know the ellipsis button, and you'll see the connect. Remember, and if you don't know, you have a QR code as well. So everyone with a LinkedIn profile has this. So I always encourage people when they're doing presentations, bring it up. It's a great way for people to connect with you, or when you're in person as well. You can just hold up your QR code and someone can connect with you like that. Okay, let's jump into it. So if you want to know a whole bunch of my background, please go to my LinkedIn profile. But I also like to just give this visual of the design scribble. So if you're not familiar with this, this is an illustration that was created by Damien Newman, who was at IDEO at the time, the world-renowned design agency and firm. And he created this to illustrate the design process. kind of need finding, problem solving, trying to figure out what the right direction is, convergence and divergence. And it's kind of messy in the middle, in the beginning, you're starting to see some clearing, and then you have some clearing to get to your direction and your design. I also like to say that this really illustrates my career path to UX. It wasn't a straight line. It was a lot of ups and downs, circles, zigzags. But what I love about this is that it was continuous. And everything that I have learned along the way of this journey has made me into the passionate, user-centered researcher that I am, people leader and people developer, or people development manager that I am today. So that is me in a nutshell, in an illustration. So let's talk about inclusive design. And I do not like to talk about inclusive design without talking about inclusive practices. I think they have to be intertwined. You cannot talk about design without talking inclusive design without talking about the practices, because a lot of times we just think about the artifact, the output of design, right? The things that we are creating. But there is so much work that has to be put in prior to the creation, prior to those designs, that really help inform the actual inclusive design as a craft, as a practice. So inclusive practices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, highlight some things, hopefully give you some actionable ways that you can start thinking about how to make sure that you are building a inclusive design culture within your organizations. So I like to call it kind of like, or put it into three buckets, or three pieces that are working together to get to inclusive design. So that being first of inclusive research. So I am a researcher by trade. That's what I do, user experience researcher, human computer interaction, my master's in human computer action and design. And so research to me is the foundation of when we're talking about how do we even get to inclusive design. And then I'm going to talk briefly about organization and culture. A lot of this is predicated on the fact that you have to have spaces and systems that are actually willing and set up to do inclusive design. Again, this is not something that's just going to pop up out of nowhere. And I know many of you can attest the fact of, getting pushback about doing some things with particular groups or timetables. And, in our culture of design and technology, where everything is, moving really fast, a lot of times, people are worried about the time it takes to do a lot of this work. And, it does take time, but the reality is it has to get done because it's important. So we're going to talk a little bit about organization and culture and why those are important when we're talking about inclusive design. So I'm going to jump right into it. And so in case you haven't noticed, I voice over a lot of my slides. I don't put a whole bunch of words on the slide. So hopefully you have notes, or you have a pen, pad, phone, however you're taking notes, because that's where a lot of the information is going to come from. So hopefully you are listening very closely. So first up, when we're talking about inclusive practices, it is imperative that we review and revamp our actual research processes. So it's not business as usual when we're doing research. And I say that because the systems have not necessarily been set up from the ground up to include these inclusive practices, right? So doing things the way that we've usually done them, very cookie cutter, is not going to yield us the results that we need to inform inclusive design or inclusive direction. So we have to take a step back and go to the root of things to say, how are we even getting the information, the insights to inform our inclusive design? And that is going to take some serious inventory of reviewing and even revamping, restructuring the actual research process. If you are always going to a particular demographic, a particular area, a particular school, because you can get quick insights, you can get participants really quickly, Is that going to get you the inclusive insights and the information that you need? It's going to take time to actually look and see, listen, we have some gaps in areas that we don't have access to. What do we need to do to make sure that we are building a network of outreach to make sure that we can have access to these groups, organizations, individuals that we're not necessarily including in our research? So ask yourself these questions, ask your organizations these questions. Leaders, you should be thinking about, how are we actually thinking about our recruiting? How are we thinking about our participants? Where are we recruiting our participants from? How often? When you're in homogenous areas or homogenous cultures, you are going to have to think out the box a little bit. How do you get access into different participants on a global scale, on a national scale, things like that? But really evaluate and ask yourself these questions, take inventory. Are you even allotting enough time for inclusive research? Again, this is not business as usual, where you can usually just go to the same group and get these quick insights or participants really quickly. A lot of times when we're talking about getting inclusive participants, if there's groups, Rama was talking about, kind of the different prongs of age and gender and ability. Those are different groups or communities that you may not have access to. So what are you going to do to make sure that you have systems in place that you can get access to those particular groups? Are you creating relationships? Are you building relationships? Are you fostering? That above anything is so important. You have to foster these relationships. Don't make them transactional. Don't just think about the tactical output of, I need to get this insight from this particular group and then I'm done. You need to stay in a constant state of curiosity when it comes to being inclusive. You need to be asking questions, listening to these groups to really hear and understand their experiences, not just within what you're trying to build, but just them as a whole. That's how you're really going to get down to understanding people, cultures, communities, and really solving the problems that they need. So build and foster relationships with different communities. And so again, different abled communities. Rama touched on something really important, that, it's, you have deaf communities, you have blind communities. You have to also thinking about abilities in terms of cognitive abilities as well. So there's so many different groups to consider, but you need to make sure that you're asking the questions of, who are we recruiting and what do our participants look like? This is an example of a study that I did almost 6 years ago, and it was more ethnographic in person, which gave me a lot more context into being able to research and inform designs when we're talking about people with low vision. Right. So, in this remote space, sometimes we don't necessarily get that true physical experience with our applications, our devices, our software, our apps, when we're not really with those people and we can actually see. And so I was able to actually understand a special keyboard somebody was using with low vision. Actually watching someone zoom in because the tap target was so small and they couldn't get to it. And that constant zooming in or making the letters extremely big because of their low vision. Things like that really take on a new form when you can inform your designs and your process when you have these groups in mind. And so this was a group for an impaired organization in Atlanta, Georgia. And what was great about this was that I was actually volunteering. And I was volunteering, and it actually led to the ability to do research. So again, being in that constant state of curiosity and opening those doors. And then also, I'm not a visually impaired person. So it was really important for me to have someone help me navigate those spaces as well. I'm not an expert in that space, so I can't speak to things. And so I needed to make sure that I was partnered with people who can speak to people who had that likability, so that again, I wasn't trying to, be in that environment and try to take control, being very mindful that I had no expertise and I was the student and I need to learn. So I wanted to get someone else to take the lead in those spaces. So that's really important to consider. You are not the expert in these spaces. Make sure that you are creating relationships with people so that they can lead you to these groups as well. And finally, when you're thinking about your research practices, this is something that was really interesting that came up. And how are you incentivizing your participants? A lot of times when we think about honoring someone's time when we're asking them for information, we're usually thinking about gift cards, right? Giving people some type of monetary gift. But what we've discovered over the years is a lot of people don't necessarily respond to that. That's not necessarily what everyone wants. And so we need to make sure that we're providing people the options that really fit their needs, being even inclusive in how we are actually rewarding or thanking people for their time. There's some people who want to donate the monetary gift that we're giving them, that we're thanking them for, or providing them for, providing to them like a gift card or something. Some people are just like, no, donate to someone else. It's not always a gift card to Amazon or something else. So be mindful of the groups that you're speaking to and ask them, what would be the most meaningful way that we could thank you for your time? It could be something really specific for someone who is visually impaired or something like, or have a different ability that they actually would want even more. So allow that flexibility in how you are incentivizing your participants, especially when you're dealing with different groups of communities. You can't just put everyone in the same bucket to think that everyone wants the same thing. So even down to that. All right, so I want to do a really quick exercise. I want you to, you don't have to close your eyes, but just get in your head a picture of what a Gen Z person looks like. Just take a moment. If you think about Gen Z people, persons, what do they look like? I like to do this exercise because it's interesting. When I think about a Gen Z person, it was a young girl, Caucasian, about 20, in her 20s, young early 20s. And what's really interesting for me is I actually have a Gen Zer. I have a daughter who is not Caucasian, and she's a Gen Zer, but that's not even the first person or the picture that I get in my head, which is really interesting. So when you think about that, we have to understand like how we are biasing. I'm actually biasing against my own child because I didn't think of her as a Gen Zer and her friends, which was really interesting. And a lot of that has to do with just the imagery that we are constantly seeing. So this is a really interesting statistic or fact. Excuse me, I'm going to grab some water. Members of the Gen Z population are more racially and ethnically diverse than any other previous generation. This was such an interesting finding. There's a huge research study, so much research studies on Gen Zers. And it's really important that we understand this, that this group is literally the most racially and ethnically diverse. They are not a monolith group. No people are, but especially these Gen Zers. And so when we talk about Gen Z, we need to be very mindful in how we are grouping them all together. And when we're thinking about designing, and this is for any group as well, but this is just an example of the research that's done because of the significance of this group, we need to be mindful of this when we're talking about it. So a lot of things is we have to get it out of our own heads of what we think Gen Zs look like and these audiences are, because more than likely they're not. And in my case, my daughter's one, and I didn't even think about that. So when you look into, again, the whole suite of what inclusive design looks like, you need to make sure in the culture of it, all of these things are in play, that research is inclusive, your insights are inclusive, you've got the design so that you can lead to the products. It is a cohesion and practice of all of these things together. We cannot talk about inclusive design without talking about all of these things working together to get there. So let's talk about organization and culture really quick. Are you set up for inclusivity? This is just a fundamental question. Everyone wants to do it, but are you even set up for inclusivity? Is your culture even willing to do the work that it is required for this? It is so important to understand that we have to create spaces where people can do this good work. And if you are in a system or an organization or team where people are just in this production type work and just putting out things and not thinking and not strategizing and not orchestrating ways to make sure that the work is inclusive, you're going to have some problems. It's going to be, such a task, and it shouldn't be. I hear stories all the time from people I mentor, just like, it's so hard. I'm the only one asking for this. No one wants to do it. My partners say it's going to take so much time. And so, again, doing the health check of your organization, your team, and your system and your culture to really ask the question, are we even set up for this? Do we even create the ways for people to be successful, to show up? And so I implore those who are leaders who are represented here today that it is important for you as leaders to do this hard work, to make sure that your teams are set up for success, that you are creating spaces for your teams to do the inclusive work. Are they able to, again, be able to reach out to these communities, create programs to incentivize people in a different way? So you really have to take a look at how you're even set up in order to do the inclusive design work. Again, review and revamp. There's a lot of this, right? Before you even start doing, you've got to do the review and revamping. Look at your team structure. I'm a big proponent that inclusivity needs to be showing up in your day-to-day, not just in your design. And I will say that again. Inclusivity needs to show up in your day-to-day and not just in your design. When you are in spaces where you can look around and see inclusivity, that's everything from race, gender, creed, social and economic differences, different communities. How are you in your own day-to-day in your space creating inclusivity? How does that show up on your team? Those are the pieces that are so fundamental when we're talking about things even prior to getting to the design. So be very mindful in, again, just making sure that team structure is actually set up for the success to really make sure that inclusive design is happening. Make sure that you have principles in place to ensure that your team is executing on inclusive design. Make sure your partners are aware. You have to bring them along this journey. You can't just one day show up and say, hey, we're going to do inclusive design. And they're like, what? What does that mean? So I won't, just don't take for granted that everyone knows what it is. We're in this UX design community and we're talking about it a lot, but I actually love when I see product owners in these communities more, because they need to be able to understand that as well. And vice versa. There's things about product we need to understand, but when we're talking about inclusive design, they need to be a part of this conversation. I always tell people when I have these type of conferences and talks, especially if it's about inclusive design, bring your product partners, bring your invite one of your friends to this, because they need to hear this. Because a lot of times, you're doing that battle and creating those team dynamics where people don't understand. And so you have to make sure that you're creating that team structure. Inclusivity requires a shift in culture. Again, going back to the research, it's you're not doing business as usual anymore, right? You've got to start looking at things differently, considering things, and really making it part of your ethos of what you're doing. You can't slap on inclusive design after the fact. You can't slap on accessibility after the fact, right? It's got to be part of the ethos. And if it's not there today, you have to start building that in from the ground up to make sure it's part of the process. That takes a culture shift. That takes people understanding that we need to be mindful of, these particular groups. We're not just designing for this particular group all the time. And I will just say this. So, you know, I've done several studies with the LGBTQIA community. And one of the things that really stood out was that there was an importance to make sure that within that community, we were actually talking to different groups, different ethnicities within that community, because not everyone's experience is the same. It's not monolith. So I needed to talk to African-American and Black people. I needed to talk to Indigenous people who identify, because their experiences can be radically different within their communities compared to others, right? Or other communities as well. So just being mindful of that. So it's a shift in culture, because that means that we're going to have to do the work to make sure that we're getting having those type of conversations. Couple of more and we'll go into Q&A here. Inclusivity requires intentionality. You have to be intentional about this. It, again, requires conversations within the organization, within the teams. This is not an individual job. When I see, designers put inclusive designer, it makes me wonder, like, does that mean you're the only one doing it? Because everyone should be mindful of this. This is not just a one-person initiative. It has to be intentional across the board. So really quick, some key takeaways here. Make sure that you are considering how to revamp and review your research practices. How are you gathering this information to inform your designs? You may have to do some changes. You may have to consider some different methodologies to make sure that you are being inclusive. And I haven't even touched on like methodologies, right? You have to make sure that your methodologies are inclusive themselves, being mindful of the groups that you are speaking to. That's another talk for another day. Take agency in actually doing the inclusive design, and make sure that your teams are set up so that they can be empowered. They can feel like they can create their inclusive work. And then make sure, leaders, you are creating those spaces for your designers, your researchers, your people that are doing the good work. Again, make sure you're connecting with me. I'd love that we just touched on this conversation. Love to keep this conversation going, seeing how it's showing up in your spaces. Also check out, I could not do this without at least a quick plug on my podcast. That's actually why I'm here today. Someone heard me on my podcast who was in Hungary. It's amazing. So check out my podcast to hear some amazing stories from amazing people. And for all you, thank you. I'm going to try, but Kusunom, for those who know. So thank you.
I think that was a pretty good stab at that. That was probably closer than I would have gotten.
Was that okay? I tried to forgive me.
Maybe if somebody knows, they can give us a thumbs up in the chat. Thank you so much. That was just so, like, what a great positive and inspiring topic to wrap up our 2 days here. So I'm really, excited. This has generated a lot of really great question answer asking over in our panel here. So I'm happy to and excited to post some of those to you. Really quick, before I do that, and while I'm getting those together, do want to remind you, jump over to that poll tab. We want to know how helpful this talk was for you. Everybody in design loves feedback, you especially in research, RENÉE. I'm sure you're like, bring it on. So give us some good feedback there. And speaking of feedback, we want to know your input on the entire experience you've had with us here at Amuse. So I believe in the chat, we'll be posting a link to a broader feedback form where you can tell us all of your your hopes, fears, things that we, checked off your list versus things you'd love to see more of, or in addition to next year. So please pop over there. Can't stress that enough. Feedback is our life. We know it.
Feedback is a gift.
Feedback is a gift. Yes. Feedback is a gift. So give us many gifts. All right, let's jump into some of these questions. You got some meaty stuff here. Okay, first up, when intentionally recruiting with inclusivity in mind, do you sometimes end up with kind of controversial insights? That is, kind of meaning different groups having different or conflicting needs and preferences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the rigor and expertise as the researcher in being able to distill that down and tell those stories. Again, it's important that we center the stories of these groups that we're speaking to, and you just be the vessel and the conduit to get their stories to the people within your organization. So yes, if they're controversial, if they're touchy, you need to be able to communicate that in an effective way. And that's why it's also important, and we all know this, and in these spaces, you make sure that you're not doing this by yourself. This needs to be a collective work. So if my designer or product owner is hearing this in, the research that we're doing, they too can take the ownership of helping to tell the story as well. And give their insights. So you don't feel like you have to bear that burden yourself to be able to distribute that information, especially if it is controversial or a touchy subject.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because, you need to be able to share those kinds of insights around, your design team, as well as, kind of advocating for, pursuing these kinds of things at the broader company level. So difficult conversations to have, but obviously very worth it. And definitely much easier to have when you've got a rally of people around you can all, cheer and shout the same stuff. So,
and I'll also say this, because I know that question can also mean like, does it mean that their views or needs or wants are so radically different that it may, change a trajectory or a vision because of this group, because it's so different and things like that. And I will say it's important for you to get that holistic understanding, because once you understand these different groups, you'll be surprised at how their needs and wants actually benefit everyone, how their issues and things actually will benefit the larger group as well. So keep that in mind.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. Okay, following up here. Do you ever consider the people doing the software development as stakeholders themselves? Do you consider their ideas and perspectives in design?
Absolutely. I think, outside of design and product, the best relationships that I've been able to foster and build are with my design partners, because they are essentially the ones who are going to be building this. And I always implore my team, make sure that you have your engineer partners as part of the process. When I was doing the research as an IC, an individual contributor, it would literally warm my heart when the engineers were actually talking about the research, when the engineers themselves can talk about the actual pain points that the participants had because they saw it. They take on a whole new ownership in the work that they're doing when they're actually closer to the person, the user that is actually going to be utilizing what they are building. It's a whole different type of engineer when they are locked into the process. So they are definitely a stakeholder for sure. And a lot of times people don't think about that, but it is really important. I learned how to do engineer speak. I could talk their language a little bit, so you have to have that common ground. We've actually done research where the engineers, so for those of you that are familiar with diary studies, we've actually done work where the engineers are actually partnered up with a participant, and they are actually watching the information that's coming in from a diary study, and they're the ones having to report back. It's a little bit of a research hack so that you're not doing all the work when you have a lot of participants, but you get people to come along with you.
Ooh, that's brilliant. I love that.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, we working with some of our developers. You talk about warming your heart. I had a similar feeling whenever we were hearing feedback from our developers that they wanted to be told the user's story, like what it is that we're trying to, do for the user, and the experience around that. They were like, okay, I know I'm doing this thing, but why am I doing it? What is it in the scope of everything? So
Yes.
absolutely
Yes.
great to include them on that conversation. Okay, so here's a good one. Do you have any suggestions about how to start building relationships with different diverse communities? What were some of the steps that you first took in that process? I'm going to add on my own question, which is it's hard to feel comfortable speaking in a dialect and using the vernacular that is that won't worry about offending anybody, if that makes sense. So how do you even start to feel more comfortable in that space? You don't want that to keep you from having these kinds of conversations. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think I just demonstrated that even in this talk, right? I attempted in a very authentic way to utilize words that I'm not even familiar with, and just, even saying kozonom or things like that, and breaking that barrier of introducing myself to a culture, to a language that I'm not familiar with. And it's little gestures like that that can make a difference. If you're just jumping into a community and saying, hey, I want to ask you some questions, yeah, that's not going to work, right? You have to be very intentional about creating and building communication first. So one thing is, if it's language barrier, things like that, learn that. Even just learning hi and hello, excuse me, hello and thank you, I think, that helped you build a bridge, right? So and I like to always tell people, like, we're more like sometimes than we are different. I think people are all automatically always thinking about the differences. So always think about also the common the things that unite you in some way, right? And find those connecting points to help you get to that point. Also, what I mentioned earlier is finding someone who has a connection with that community is really important. So I'll give an example. At a larger company, we have infinity groups where there's groups of people who identify in a particular way. And we have an organization that actually helps organize the affinity groups. Well, in order to get access to that infinity group, I actually asked someone who is more of the organizer to say, hey, I would love to be able to speak to, this community, but I don't want to just run into that community. Can you help create an introduction? Can you be the one to let them know and then let me know if it's okay?
Mm-hmm.
So get someone to help build that bridge for you as well can make a difference.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I love the notion of, just showing that you've made some sort of attempt already to learn about them, to meet them where they are. I can, totally understand that would, kind of break down some of those barriers. So
yes.
Excellent. I love that. Great answer. Let's see, we got some more rolling here. How I think we kind of touched on this, but since we're talking about some of the difficult aspects of trying to expand this, we talked about bringing in others with you when you're going to have those conversations. What can be a good platform to start those kinds of conversations with others in your company, maybe your stakeholders, your executives? How can you, instead of just coming out of the blue and saying, blam, here's all of my, feedback and insights, and, we need to do this thing, what's a good way you can kind of bring that into the fold in a natural way?
In terms of setting up an environment, a culture for inclusivity, is that what we're talking about?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's ownership on leadership to help do that. A lot of times when ICs or people who are more junior are tasked with that, it's just the anxiety is just too much, right? It has to be something that is led by people who have a louder voice, so that they can, again, create the pathways and the signal that it's okay to do this thing, so that more people are willing to come along. So I'm a firm believer that it has to be a top bottom type thing where it's really being supported, initiated. And then if it's not initiated from the top and it is more of like a ground up type initiative, make sure that you get a champion, someone who can actually build that bridge to those different organizations. A lot of times we try to, again, do it on our own, get in there, and we don't have the right vernacular, the language, same thing like you were saying, to really speak to the executive level, things like that. But if you get, they call executive sponsor or something like that, someone that you can really bring along so that when they are in those spaces that you don't have access to, they are helping to plant the seed along the way. And I said this before, this is a process. This is not something that just shows up on the front door and then the next thing you know, you're doing inclusive work. You have to be intentional about it and set up the system so that it can be inviting for the work that's about to come.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not just a box you're checking.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
These are such great questions. I love them.
I know we've got some great, I think I've got two more that have popped up in here. We're kind of at time, but maybe we can squeeze one of them in. Do you believe that there are culturally neutral products, either in business to business or tech areas, things like that, as an example, where inclusivity doesn't play that big of a role? So it's almost a little more immune to it.
I mean,
and maybe the answer is no.
Yeah, I don't think there is. I mean, if there's multiple people using, and then again, inclusivity is a it's compromised. It comprises of many different parts and things, right? And I think Rama illustrated that with all the different parts, with the 4 kind of areas, with age, ability, gender. So there's different ways to look at it, right? I think a lot of times we go right to race, but it is, it's bigger than that when we talk about inclusivity. So I don't think there's really any system, any product, whether B2B or not, that doesn't incorporate some type of inclusivity. Maybe B2B doesn't have as much. Maybe it's when we're looking at compared to like consumer products. B2B probably has a lot more work to do, but but that's a great question now.
Yeah.
Who asked that question? Because I would love to ponder on that even some more.
An anonymous person here. So if you happen to ask that question, please follow up with RENÉE after this, because it sounds like a great conversation to continue.
Yeah, I would love to continue that conversation. But yeah, my initial answer is no. I don't think there is, because even in a homogenous environment, right, with one culture of people, there's still going to be different types of people within that monolith community, and not even monolith, the homogenous. There's still other areas. So it'll show itself in different ways.
Yeah, as long as it's some context of people working with people. So
I love that.
Fantastic. Well, we are about at time. I just want to say thank you so much. What an awesome way to end this day, this 2 days that we've had here together. Really appreciate you spending your time with us.